That's fair. I think at the end of the Cold War, quite a lot of people suggested that the division to replace political allegiances, class allegiances, would turn out to be culture. And that includes Jacques Delors, it includes Samuel Huntington, people like that. And they had kind of various suggestions of why this would be the case and what the underlying dynamic would be. So some suggested that culture was this sort of ancient form of allegiance, the sort of traditional religions, traditional kind of cults coming to the fore when the old ideologies which had kept these things under wraps were dissipating. So the sort of idea of return to the ancient, which is very much Samuel Huntington. He talked about the re-emergence of older trends and deeper currents, and he kind of looked around the world and he saw these nations splitting along older trends and deeper currents. Other people would see culture as a cover for economic interest. So they would say, well, people identifying as Islamic, actually what they're really doing in protesting against France is they're making the point about the exclusion of Muslim communities in France, of the economic exclusion and poverty and that sort of thing, history of colonialism. So they would see new forms of Islamism as a sort of new form of protest, a cover for economics. And so Slavoj Žižek talks about the culture war as a class war, or a misplaced class war. So kind of social tensions being displaced into this new mode of culture and identity because they can no longer take the old form, so it's a sort of displacement into the new. And then you had another theory, which people like Jean Baudrillard and Benjamin Barber, who talked about culture, particularly Islam, as a form of resistance to marketization and globalization. So Baudrillard calls Islam as a singularity, he talks about it as a singularity that challenges the market system. So in the world where everything is for sale, there's no polarity, there's no opposition anymore, there's no two systems, nothing outside of the market. He talks about the challenge of Islam with its irreducible and dangerous alterity and symbolic challenge. So he very much sees it as being the kind of point of authentic culture which stands against the kind of global world within which everything is one and seamless and without tension or conflict. So he sees the kind of tension that exists within the system as appearing at this point. Now obviously at a very strange time, or very potent time at the moment, since that Charlie Hebdo cover was published, increasingly you're every few weeks there is an incident, and the fracture that's growing within European societies is clearer and clearer. And the sorts of things that young Muslim Europeans are saying, is really quite striking. So very much seeing themselves as not with Brussels, not with Paris, but with Raqqa. They're on the other side of the line. There's a very firm line, and they're not with Europe. They're with there. They stand with with Mes Frères Musulmans, and so they're with the Muslims against Europe, and very much see their own society as a society of misbelievers and unbelievers and as nothing. And so they have this kind of point of belonging outside of that. I mean, I think that really the dynamic behind this phenomenon of the Europeans going abroad, coming back, attacking, is really quite different to anything to do with ancient cultures or a cover for economic allegiances. It's a very new dynamic. And it's actually quite similar to the sort of stuff that Claire's talking about in terms of the dynamics on university campuses. So, the kind of gay, bi, gender fluid societies forming and banning each other's speakers and talking about their identities. I think there's quite a lot of similarities, obviously not in consequences, but I think in form and underlying causes, they're quite different. And I think this is really a conflict, but it's not a conflict in classical terms. I think conflict in terms of the coming together of two forces in hostile opposition. I don't think there can be any resolution. I think it's more the form that is taken by the unravelling of European culture. It's a pattern of unravelling or of collapse, and not a fighting out of forces. So I'm going to look at some of the French thinkers on this, because there has been quite a debate in France, and quite a lot of the observers of the new political Islam in France are quite philosophical, and so they sort of a bit more successful than others maybe in terms of getting at some of the principles behind it. So I think the first distinct feature of the new kind of radical Islam is that the cultural category is completely separated from any kind of underlying relations. So Olivier Roy, he's looked at kind of new generation of young jihadis, and he talks about the free-floating religious marker. So the idea that your cultural identity or your religion is not something that is about your relationship to other people, or your embodiment in a community, or your reflection over any kind of life world or beliefs or anything like that. He talks about it as a marker. And I think in other areas of life we talk about a label or a category or an identity, but essentially all these are things that are relatively detached from your actual social relations. It's kind of like a label you kind of stick on your lapel. And so for the new Islamists, what they're defined by is their detachment from any kind of Islamic community or philosophy. Really the kind of bits and pieces of Islamic history are there on the floor for them to kind of pick up again and reuse and reassemble in various combinations, but in a completely arbitrary manner. If you look at a battalion of jihadis, there's nothing joining them. They're from everywhere, every class, every background. You look at a map of Islamic State recruitment, and there's arrows from every part of the world. Just arrows going in all directions. There's no kind of logic. Not this part, but not that part. It's just all these arrows. And the theorist Fazil Devji talks about this as a kind of world of accidental relations or accidental universe, where the lines on the battlefield are not indicative of people's underlying interests or of solidarity or of conflict. The line is accidental. It's not necessary. And it sort of means that really the religious form, the form taken by religion, is no longer susceptible to sociological analysis. So in the way that people would look at religion in the past and say, this represents this state of human consciousness or this form of society, or you can sort of critique the forms taken by religion. I don't think that's any longer the case with Islam. So ISIS is a kind of brand. You've got the song, you've got the finger, and the flag, and those are really the kind of elements of it. And you can do whatever you like, and you stick those things on it, and it becomes an ISIS attack. Which is quite a transformation from Al Qaeda. They actually kind of bought plane tickets for people and sent money and told them what to do, and there was an organisation, a line of command, and a hierarchy. You see now there's an attack, and there's kind of a couple of days where ISIS is sort of waiting to thinking about whether it's theirs or not, and kind of judging the terrain. But basically, that is a policy they've instigated, where they said it's not an organisation, it's a system. Basically, they instigated this policy of do-it-yourself kind of attacks. So I think that this is really is a kind of cultural marker that exists in a global space that's really indifferent to place. You looked at the way that the Paris attackers worked, and they did a sort of a grand tour of Europe. So they were in Belgium, and then they went to Lille to buy some DIY products to make bombs, and they went to Greece and Birmingham, and really they did a kind of tour of Europe. But this kind of globalism of jihadis, the way they work, is not about the grand tour in terms of people being grounded in lots of particular places. It's about completely indifference to place. They don't care where they are. Everywhere they are, it's nowhere. And so there's a kind of movement and a new globalism that's not cosmopolitanism, but that's a sort of indifference. And the kind of new ummah that they talk about, the new terrorist ummah, is entirely abstract thing. I think all the concepts that they use, so jihad as well, have become an entirely meaningless, abstract kind of concept. So historically, jihad was very much the duty to defend the community. So Jean-Paul Charmet, in a book called Islam and War, talks about the way in which jihad was a mechanism for forging collective action in a sort of Bedouin society, which kind of had kind of archaic and kind of fragmented nature. And so it's about encouraging that collective action towards the goal. So it was about defense of the community and then expansion of the empire. And it was very much that kind of terms in which you could have a war, terms in which you couldn't, and the motivation of the whole society to act collectively. But now jihad is essentially what anyone wants it to mean. It's a label you stick on whatever you want to do. I think this role of culture as a marker is very much considered multiculturalism. So in a way, in the realm of multiculturalism, everything has become detached from its origins. So you have a panel with a Muslim community representative, Jewish community representative. Everyone is community representative of. But you get all the elements of religion sort of sitting side by side, but detached from their origins, and really as kind of symbols, in the kind of strange world of the state, as symbols of cultures and not as cultures themselves. So I think that is very much kind of formative of this development. What's really striking is that the kind of new kind of culture that people identify with, so the culture as a brand or a label, is almost no role for the inner life. Because you think about periods before when there's been a collapse of social forms and things have all sort of fallen apart, and you've often had quite a strong return to the inner. So you had Hellenism, Socrates, so points when the Athenian state or the Roman state were crumbling, then there was a sort of people retreated into themselves and sought the truth within. And obviously important discoveries were made in that return into self. And what's striking now is the almost complete lack of inner life to the new cultural identities. So what they're talking about is entirely external. So signs, markers, categories. It's a kind of, the identity is a box within which people sit rather than something that they feel in their heart. There's 52 gender identity categories, you can choose one of them. There's a way in which nothing is felt in an inward manner. It's sort of, they're out there and you choose your place within them. And I think a lot of the kind of new religious ostentatiousness is related to this. So the kind of the beards and Islam becomes beards, headscarves, certain kind of cod Arabic phrases which repeat by people who don't speak Arabic all the time, which apparently in Arabic we don't say that all the time. So it's a kind of ostentatious culture. Olivier Wyre talks about this kind of ostentatiousness of proving your belief to others, rather than that kind of inner kind of meaning given to it. So yes, you have kind of very subjective elements in terms of egotism, vanity, that kind of stuff. And you certainly saw this with the behaviour of a lot of the terrorists who video themselves live quite a lot. I think the recent attack on French police officers, he streamed live on Facebook, and there's a real narcissism there and a kind of infantile kind of conduct, which also is quite strikingly different to that of the 9/11 hijackers. So you get that element of egotism, but you don't get any kind of inner life or grounding of the individual. So I think that's the first point, is really the detachment of cultural identities from cultural relations and from the inner life of the individual. More than that, I think that new cultural identities are turned against social relations and social forms. So the meaning of jihad now is actually about standing in a state of opposition with where you're from. It's stepping outside of the society and putting yourself in a state of opposition with it, which is obviously the exact opposite of what its meaning was historically. So one of the Paris attackers said, since I've been into religion, that has been in the way of jihad. I know that this is my place here. So for him, religion is the way of jihad, it's not anything else. And almost every terrorist has broken with their family. And that's not a coincidence. There is a sort of very much a turning against the family, against the community, against the country. And so it's a cultural form that's really a state of alienation from culture. And it's sort of holding yourself in opposition to cultural relations. So there's one attacker who had 9 sisters, which quite a lot of sisters. And he said, family is nothing to me, religion is everything. You can have 9 sisters and you can say they're infidels. He objected even to the language of the family. He told them they shouldn't speak local Arabic, but they should all speak literary Arabic, because that's the kind of purified international jihadi language. thing they always talk about is about taking out a complete rupture with the society of unbelievers, mécréants. And it's that kind of, and disavowing oneself of the society. And the new discovery of the new place, so they're belonging in Syria, or their new brothers that they're discovering, is a result of this rupture that they're carrying out with the society. It doesn't have any meaning apart from that. So they really belong in Syria because they don't belong in Brussels or in Paris. And their imagined brothers in every part of the Muslim world is only a consequence of their lack of connection with those that they actually have a relationship with. You can see this with Salafism, which is a kind of new form of Islam, and really is defined by being in opposition to absolutely everything in this Muslim history and in Western history. So they're really against traditional Islam in terms of local ceremonies and stuff. They're against Islamic philosophy. They're against Islamic jurisprudence. They're against any form of Western influence. They're against modernism. They're basically against pretty much any social form you can think of in the Muslim world or in the Western world. And what it is as a religion is defined by its opposition to every part of the social universe. It's against all forms of social particularity. So I think that really the new jihadi identity is not something. It's not its own form. So the terrorists did not represent anything positive, but were only negative in form. That kind of rejection of other sets of social relations. And so I think really the new cultural forms are a pursuit of self-alienation in a way. They're seeking one's exiling from society as a positive state and as the end. So what they want is to be exiled. That becomes the kind of pursuit. And the sociologist Wendy Brown made this point about a lot of identity politics. She said that politicized identity is attached to its own exclusion, and it's premised on this exclusion for the very existence of its identity. So it's very much it's a seeking of the alienated or the exiled state, and not actually anything of any kind of positive quality. So a couple of the Paris attackers, in terms of talking about what they were doing, they both said exactly the same thing, where they said, I'm going to make everything explode. And it was that just sort of general, everything's going to go pop. And that was the kind of meaning of their actions. It wasn't, I'm going to achieve this, I represent that, I'm sacrificing for this. It was just this sort of, everything's going to go pop. And it's that kind of total negation of everything, which is the moment of the explosion, which was the kind of goal. I think really the role of cultural conflict now has a very different meaning. So I think, historically conflict, Clausewitz talks about war and conflict as being two hostile bodies coming into collision. So essentially starting with the wrestlers, you have two sets of interests grappling for supremacy. So each is grounded in its own will, and those wills conflict, and conflict emerges from that. I think really what happens now is the conflicts are not the result of people having different cultures, but rather of not having anything on which to ground themselves. So it really comes from the lack of distinctive qualities from both sides. And you can see that with the French debate around the French burqa ban. The fact that the French women are wearing the burqa ban anyway, the burqa anyway, is kind of crazy, because it's a second generation thing. Their mothers didn't wear even a headscarf often, so it has that kind of ostentatious element. And a lot of demonstrations against the burqa ban, the women in burqas were biting police officers and that sort of thing. So not terribly feminine Islamic behaviour. So I think that it's really the burqa is that kind of sign of their rejection of French society, and rather than having the traditional meaning in terms of women's seclusion from the public sphere and their involvement in a kind of set of patriarchal relations. So one of the cousin of one of the Paris terrorists, she had a photograph taken. She was flashing a V, and she was wearing a burqa. And those two things I think really went together in terms of a kind of F off to French society, and also and the burqa. Those two things have the same real meaning. So that's on the one hand, the burqa has this meaning for the young people who are wearing it as this kind of label showing their their non-belonging. But on the other hand, for the French state, the burqa has taken on this massive meaning, and not just the French state, every intellectual from the left to the right, they are obsessed with the burqa, and before people started blowing everyone up, they thought it was the biggest threat to civilization. I think now they've sort of got things in a bit of perspective, but really, in terms of the left, the right, and it's really the meaning of the burqa is a kind of, it's taken on this sort of meaning as the opposition to French Republican identity. So really, there's an increasing attempt to define laicism or French Republican identity in terms of opposition to the burqa or to certain Islamic cultural forms. So there was a case of a worker in a private nursery who was sacked for wearing a headscarf, and there was a petition to have a law that no worker in a private nursery could ever wear a headscarf ever again. And they said that such behaviour puts our collective life in peril. So it's kind of a headscarf at a private nursery puts our collective life in peril. When such things exist, we cannot relate, we cannot have a Republican society. So I think you really see with the conflict around the burqa on both sides, what is driving the conflict is not actually the existence of two separate cultures, but actually the loss of being on both sides. And that's what is driving the conflict. The thing that is coming together is both sides actually searching for their point of self-definition. And arguing over a symbol, basically, which I think is why you get a lot of conflicts around particular symbols now, because the role of the symbol is almost like it's a fetishized point against which both sides can kind of try and define themselves. So French culture is not burqa, the burqa is not France. So I think that those kind of polarities develop. And so when you arrive at a French airport now, there's a picture of Marianne not wearing a burqa, and it says the Republic doesn't cover its face, and that's the definition of Republic. The Republic doesn't cover its face. Whereas actually, 15 years ago, no one really cared about burqa or headscarf. Sarkozy, who banned headscarf, banned burqa in public spaces, he was really, in the mid-90s, he was not bothered at all. He said, it doesn't matter, actually in schools, kids should be able to wear headscarves, it's not a big deal. Basically, there was a shift over a 15-year period, which was to do with the waning of Republican identity and that kind of look for symbols against which to define it. Is that hot round? Oh my goodness. Right.
You got a bit longer.
It's okay. I think really what you see in these conflicts is really not a sense of people having something, but a sense of loss, humiliation, non-recognition, of lack. I think this is the case in jihadis being all big and brave and blowing people up, and it's the case with students complaining about their reputation or representation or a word someone used. Underlying it is this sort of sense of non-recognition, humiliation, of loss, and the battle is coming out of that. And so the attack on the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, really that was the whole idea was vengeance, to avenge yourself against the source of humiliation. And that's actually much more important. The kind of idea of avenging the Prophet is much more important than any kind of relationship to Allah. They don't actually talk about Allah at all. There's no kind of consideration of that kind of any universal meaning of God or anything like that. It's all about that kind of vengeance of humiliation. And very much a feeling that people always talk about not feeling chez soi, so not feeling at home where you are. And so the battle comes out of that lack of feeling at home. Now this is not a French theorist, but he talks like one. Zizek in Against the Double Blackmail says, he talks about the way in which conflict comes out of people sensing the other person's having a lot better time than you are. So he talks about the other jouissance is insupportable for us because we cannot find a proper way to relate to our own jouissance. It is to resolve this deadlock that the subject projects the core of its own jouissance onto another, attributing to this other full access to constant jouissance. So translated, that is basically people see others as the cause of their own inner lack. So they see other others as a positive to their absence, the substance to their lack. And so each is externalising its lack of will onto the others. There's the opposite dynamic to a Clausewitzian war, so not two wills coming into hostile opposition, but each externalising its own lack of will onto the other, which you then pursue in an attempt to reground yourself. Which is why you get a very strange anti-Semitism now among Muslim youth in France. They're all obsessed with Jews, and they've never even met a Jew, and absolutely no relationships with Jews of any kind. But the word that they use to describe Jews is a kind of emotion, a kind of disgust, and it's that kind of the anti-Semitism is really an explanation for their own kind of predicament. So I think that really what we're seeing is a culture war which is not only an expression of a lack of social relations, but it's a positive agent in the decomposition of social relations. So it's the active pursuit of social decomposition, the active pursuit of self-alienation. Gilles Capel, the French Islamist theorist, he talked about the different periods of Islamic fundamentalism coming from European societies. So the first form in the 80s was a leaving of the home. So people going off to Afghanistan, to Bosnia, to defend particular Islamic communities. The second form, which was 98 to 2005, was Al-Qaeda, which was very much the organisation against the American Colossus. So that was a period when they bombed embassies, obviously the targets of 9/11, which are really a kind of critique of the symbols of American power, military, economic, political. And then the third form, which is 2005 onwards, which is really a kind of turning back against the home. So you leave the home, you fight the far enemy, and then actually right now you turn back against the home. And so now you have what he calls the rhizome jihadism, which is essentially Europeans turning against their own society. And they're producing all these policy documents basically saying you should just kill anyone, which is kind of questionable why you need to release a document to say that, but it's that real, any form of reaction against your homeland is given the name of jihad. So you see those sorts of, that periodization. And really this third form of jihadism is the pursuit of decomposition within European societies. And I think the context for this is some of the things we've been discussing in other sessions in terms of the way that the European elite has pursued its own social decomposition in many ways. Every political party has distanced itself from its own electorate, and there's a kind of romance of the state of homelessness or the state of being a refugee, of that kind of non-grounded subject. Everyone wants to be a volunteer in Sangatte or to have a refugee in their home, or it's that kind of romance of detachment. And really, I think that the current form of jihadism is really a representation of that internal movement in an external form. So the historic role of Islam at the moment, I think it is a historic role. It is playing a particular role that no other ideology is playing. And so I think people who say it's nothing to do with Islam are wrong. There is a particular dynamic that is occurring, and really the role of Islam is to give an appearance of a positive or transcendent element to the process of decomposition or collapse. It's the thing that allows the pursuit of alienation and destruction to appear in a positive form, a universal form. It appears as a line, which is you're with Paris or you're with Raqqa, you're with these people or those people. So I would very much disagree with Baudrillard when he says that Islam stands as a challenge to the radical indifference sweeping the world. I think that really the role it's playing currently is the active pursuit of that radical indifference and making that into a battle cry. And it's very much accelerating and amplifying that process of self-decomposition of European societies. So it allows the nihilistic reaction, which we saw in Munich. I think everybody was relieved that Munich wasn't an Islamic terrorist attack, but it could have been. They could have just put a different flag on it and it would have been. But that kind of nihilistic reaction, it allows those things to appear as if they're a soldier. You know, they're not just a nutter, they're a soldier. So it's the appearance of something being outside. So the process of collapse is able to appear as if through an outside force. I think Hegel says that the point of objectification is very important. He said things appear to us from outside. So something that is internal, is in the air, actually is being objectified in Islam as some kind of outside initiated kind of process. So when kind of hollow forms collapsing, it appears that Islam is knocking them over. And the role of jihadism is really to set itself against every hollow form. You know, really from Russia and Afghanistan onwards, they've been against hollow regimes, against hollow Russia, and now against hollow societies. And really, they think that they're knocking them down, but actually they're sort of conjured up as the gravediggers. So I think really what we're seeing is not a guise for class relations or for other kind of relations of political tension, nor are we seeing a new cultural logic, nor are we seeing old cultures returning, but really we're seeing an objectification of the process of unravelling. And Islam provides a guise whereby the process of collapse plays out as if through an outside force. So I think in this context, really we should defend almost any positive social form, anything that has its own authentic basis, and whether that is traditional Muslim culture or European cosmopolitanism, or obviously from our point of view the culture of the Enlightenment, but anything that actually has authentic being against these alienated cultural forms, so against the label of cultural identity, which is set against social relations and is based on estranging yourself from social relations and eclipsing your own inner life. So anything that is sincerely about self-belief, about the drawing of lines. There was an episode over Christmas in Corsica where a group of people from the Muslim community trapped some firemen and basically beat them up. They set a trap for them and beat them up. And after that, there was a march of people into the Muslim areas. They said they were looking for the perpetrators, but they were marching through it, and they were saying "Onay Sheh Swat," and they were basically saying we're at home and there are rules here. And if it had been police, they wouldn't have cared. But because it was firemen who put themselves at risk, there was an ethic. The ethic of the community had been violated. And they essentially marched and said, there are lines, and you don't do that. And obviously they were condemned, and everyone said this is vigilantism and distanced themselves from this march. But actually, for me, that was about a drawing of a line that was a positive thing, and saying that this is community, there are values, and there are lines. So I think cultures that are themselves, that are absorbed in themselves, and not obsessed with what the other person's doing all the time, are the things that have positive being. So Zizek says that the primary vice is not to be an egotist, but to be more preoccupied with others than with himself. You know, it's the person that is all the time opposing to the other, that actually has no being himself. I think in this I'm absolutely against Baudrillard. I think he describes very well the state of alienated cultural relations where cultural forms have lost their meaning and their positive existence, and conflicts aren't really conflicts anymore, and you know all that kind of stuff. But he basically says this is the world of mystification, of alienation, and that's it. That's where we are now. I don't think that's true, and I think that you should take his analysis as a point to set up against, to celebrate affirm the forms of real culture over the forms of alienated culture. And so whether that's being a genuine kind of European cosmopolitan and traveling everywhere and tasting all the different elements, or of defending a national culture, I think that the defense of what is real against what is alienated is, for me, is the genuine locus to a culture war that can have some meaning and can return sort of body to the social against the sort of pursuit of alienation and collapse.